The thermometer read 32 degrees when Henry Crawford walked into his barn at 4:30 in the morning, and he knew this was the moment everything hung on. Not tomorrow when it might warm up, not next week when snow could make the work impossible. Right now. He had been watching the sky for 3 weeks, checking temperatures twice daily, because the difference between perfect timing and waiting one day too long could mean the difference between feeding his family through winter or watching 300 pounds of meat spoil before his eyes. His wife Margaret was already dressed in the kitchen, her hands moving through the familiar motions of brewing coffee, strong enough to fuel the next 18 hours of work that would not stop for anything. Their sons Robert and Charles were hauling split hickory to the scalding area where the massive cast-iron kettle sat waiting to be fired. Everyone in the family understood what was about to happen. 3 hogs would be transformed from living animals into a year's worth of preserved food before sunset tomorrow, or 6 months of feeding and planning would be lost. Henry looked at the 3 Hampshire hogs penned separately in the barn, fasted for 3 days to ensure clean butchering. The largest probably weighed 300 pounds, fattened on 40 bushels of corn that Henry could have sold for cash, but chose instead to invest in meat. The other 2 were smaller, but together the 3 animals represented 800 pounds of pork that had to be preserved without a single day of refrigeration. Every method his grandfather had taught him would be tested over the next 6 weeks. Salt curing that drew moisture through osmosis, cold smoking that deposited antibacterial compounds, lard preservation that sealed out oxygen and decay. His neighbor, Frank Morrison, had tried to save a few dollars last year by cutting the saltpeter from his cure, and Henry had watched Frank bury a 20-pound ham in the manure pile after his wife cut into it at Christmas and found green slime at the bone. 50 meals lost because someone got cheap with a 2-ounce ingredient. By 5:30, his neighbor Tom Wilkins arrived with his oldest son, and the 4 men began the work that would not pause until every piece of meat was secure. The first hog was dispatched and hoisted into the scalding tank where water had to be exactly 150 degrees, hot enough to loosen hair without cooking the skin. Henry tested it by plunging his bare hand in for a second, judging temperature by feel because a thermometer could break and timing was everything. Too hot and the hair would set like concrete in the follicles, turning what should be a 20-minute job into 3 hours of brutal scraping. He had learned this 10 years back when impatience cost him 2 hog skins and made his family's winter harder than it needed to be. The men worked in practiced silence, scraping the carcass with bell scrapers until the skin gleamed white and clean, then hoisting it for gutting. Henry's knife moved along familiar paths, separating intestines without puncturing them, because one mistake could contaminate the entire carcass with bacteria that would race through the meat faster than any cure could stop it. By 7 o'clock, the first hog hung clean in the barn, cooling in the November air while they started on the second. Margaret came out with biscuits and sausage left from last year's preservation, and they ate standing up because sitting down would break the momentum they needed to maintain. The butchering continued through the morning, Henry breaking each carcass into cuts that would receive different treatments based on size and fat content. The hams, massive 20-pound pieces of meat surrounding the femur, would get 4 weeks of salt cure followed by 2 weeks of cold smoking. The bacon slabs with their beautiful striping would need lighter curing and shorter smoke. The shoulders would go into Margaret's pressure canner, the device that could heat jars to 240 degrees and create temperatures high enough to kill Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria that caused the kind of poisoning that had killed the Hendricks girl 3 counties over, when her mother tried to can meat without proper equipment. Margaret had heard that story from the doctor himself, and she never took shortcuts with her canning after that. By noon, all 3 hogs were completely broken down, and Margaret started the curing process that would run for the next month. She had mixed the cure before dawn, following her grandmother's German recipe. 8 pounds of coarse salt, 2 pounds of dark brown sugar, 2 ounces of saltpeter for every 100 pounds of meat. She laid the 6 massive hams on the wooden table in the smokehouse and packed each one thick with cure, working the mixture into every crevice around the bone with her fingers, because any spot she missed would be where bacteria started multiplying, working inward from a microscopic colony until the entire ham turned to green slime and wasted potential. Her hands burned from the salt, but she kept working because there was no alternative to getting this exactly right. While Margaret packed the hams in cure, Henry and the boys started rendering fat, cutting the thick white layers into 1-inch cubes that went into the rendering kettle. The temperature had to stay moderate, hot enough to melt fat efficiently, but not so hot that it scorched and ruined the taste of everything they would cook for the next year. Margaret supervised between packing hams, adjusting the fire by adding small sticks or raking coals, judging the heat by how the fat bubbled. Too violent and it would scorch. Too gentle and rendering would take 3 days instead of 1, risking spoilage of the fat itself before it could be preserved. As the fat rendered down and afternoon arrived, Margaret began working on the fresh sausage that would spoil in 2 days even in November cold if she did not act fast. She mixed shoulder meat and trimmings with sage, black pepper, red pepper flakes and salt, formed the mixture into patties, and fried each one completely until no pink remained. The cooked patties went into crocks packed tight. Then Charles ladled hot rendered lard over them until they were completely submerged. As the lard cooled, it would create an airtight seal that kept out the oxygen that bacteria needed to multiply. Stored at 40 degrees in the cellar, those sausage patties would feed breakfast after breakfast, while snow covered the ground and fresh meat was impossible to keep. The tenderloin got the same treatment, sliced thin and fried until cooked through, then packed in smaller crocks with lard sealing them from exposure. Margaret was calculating as she worked, tracking every pound. 40 pounds of lard for preserving cooked meats, 60 pounds for cooking and baking through the year. The cracklings left after rendering would go into cornbread. Nothing could be wasted, because her family ate roughly 800 pounds of meat annually, and every ounce had to be accounted for. By midnight, the first day was done, but the real test was just beginning. Henry lay awake thinking about the next 6 weeks and everything that could go wrong. 4 weeks of curing with fresh salt mixture, applied every 7 days as the meat released moisture, that would dilute the cure and allow spoilage to start if he did not stay vigilant. 2 weeks of cold smoking with hickory fires that had to be maintained day and night without getting too hot or too cool. Then storage in the cellar, where temperature and humidity would need constant monitoring until the last ham was consumed a year from now. His neighbor, John Peterson, had lost 3 hams last spring when unexpected warm weather pushed his cellar temperature into the 60s, and he did not check them for 4 days. John had smelled the rot before he saw it, and his family ate beans and cornbread for 2 months as punishment for his inattention. The next morning, Margaret fired up her pressure canner and began processing shoulder meat in quart jars, while Henry started the daily routine of checking the curing hams. She packed the chunks tight, added salt and water, sealed the jars with metal lids and rubber rings, then brought the canner up to 15 pounds of pressure, where it had to stay for 75 minutes. The gauge required constant watching because if pressure dropped below 15 pounds, the temperature would not reach 240 degrees, and botulism spores could survive to kill whoever opened that jar months later. She ran batch after batch through the morning, producing 36 quarts of shelf-stable meat that could sit on cellar shelves for 2 years if the seals held. Through November and into December, Henry checked the curing meat every single day, without exception. Each week he unwrapped every piece, brushed away the old cure that had become wet and clumped with extracted moisture, and repacked everything with fresh mixture. The hams were transforming, becoming firmer and darker as salt drew water out through osmosis, their weight dropping as they changed from fresh meat into something that could last a year. He tracked the weight loss obsessively because the hams needed to lose at least 20% of their moisture for the cure to penetrate completely. But if they lost more than 25%, they would be too dry and tough to eat. After 4 weeks, they were perfect, and when Henry pressed his thumb into the meat, it felt exactly right. That specific firmness that meant complete penetration. He rinsed each ham briefly to remove surface salt, rubbed them with black pepper and brown sugar, and hung them in the smokehouse for the transformation that would make them shelf-stable for a year. The smoking required even more attention than curing. Henry needed steady smoke at temperatures between 75 and 90 degrees, which meant tending fire every few hours around the clock for 2 solid weeks. He used hickory exclusively, cut into pieces small enough to smolder, and produce thick, cool smoke without burning hot. The smoke would deposit creosote and other compounds on the meat's surface that killed bacteria and created a dry, protective crust. But the process could not be rushed, or the hams would cook instead of cure. Margaret took the night shifts, waking every 2 hours to check temperature by feeling the air inside the smokehouse and judge smoke thickness by its color in the lantern light. Their lives revolved around that building, meals planned so someone was always available to maintain the fire that could not die or burn too hot. On the 13th night of smoking, disaster struck without warning. Henry woke at 3 in the morning to Margaret screaming that the smokehouse was on fire, and he ran through the darkness in his long underwear to find flames climbing the inside wall where a windshift had blown sparks from the firebox into dried creosote buildup that had ignited like gasoline. The 6 hams hung directly above the flames, 6 months of work and a year's food supply seconds away from being destroyed, or so badly smoke damaged they would be inedible. Henry grabbed the water bucket and threw it on the flames while Margaret ran into the smoke-filled building and started pulling hams down from the racks, working blind in smoke so thick she could not see her hands. The heat was intense enough to blister skin, but she kept pulling hams down and passing them out to Henry, who carried them to the snow and laid them out to cool. They got 5 hams out before the flames died, but when Henry went back in for the 6th, he found it had been scorched black on one side. The muslin wrapper burned away and the surface charred. He carried the damaged ham outside and examined it in the lantern light while Margaret coughed up black phlegm from the smoke she had inhaled. The char was deep on one side, penetrating maybe a 1/4 inch into the meat, but when Henry scraped it away with his knife, he found that underneath the damage the cure had held, and the meat was still good. It was not perfect, but it was salvageable, and that made the difference between having enough meat through winter and running short in March when supplies always ran lowest. They had lost nothing, though it had been close enough to failure that Henry's hands shook as he wrapped the damaged ham in fresh muslin and hung it back in the smokehouse after checking every inch of the building for other fire hazards. After 2 weeks, the hams emerged from the smokehouse transformed. They had taken on a deep mahogany color, their surface was dry and hard, and they smelled of hickory smoke and black pepper and something indefinable that meant safety and success. Henry wrapped each one in clean muslin and hung them in the coolest, driest corner of the cellar, where they would wait until needed. It was mid-December, and the family finally had their year's meat supply secured. 6 hams at 12 pounds each after curing and smoking had removed moisture, 30 bacon slabs, 40 crocks of sausage and tenderloin sealed in lard, 36 quarts of canned pork, 800 pounds of preserved food created from 3 hogs without a single day of refrigeration, using only salt, smoke, lard, and knowledge that had been refined through generations of necessity. That night, Henry stood in the cellar looking at the fruits of 6 weeks of constant work, and he felt something that went beyond simple relief. His family would eat well through winter and into next autumn. They had meat for trade if cash ran short. They had security that could not be purchased at any store because it was built on knowledge and skill rather than money. When he taught Robert and Charles how to judge, cure, and maintain smoking fires and pack meat in lard, he was passing forward something more valuable than land or livestock. The ability to preserve food without refrigeration meant his sons could feed their families regardless of what economic disasters or personal hardships the future might bring. The techniques of salt curing, cold smoking, and lard preservation sustained American farm families through the Great Depression, World War II rationing, and countless personal hardships, when the ability to feed yourself made the difference between survival and destitution. Those methods, proven through centuries of use and passed down through generations, represented practical wisdom that helped build rural America's resilience and self-reliance. Thank you for watching this documentary about traditional meat preservation methods. If you found this exploration of agricultural history valuable, please subscribe to our channel for more content about the skills and knowledge that sustained farming communities. Give this video a like and share it with others who appreciate rural American heritage. This video is a fictional dramatization inspired by the real-life experiences of hundreds of American farm families who used these preservation techniques from the 1930s through the 1970s. While Henry Crawford and his family are representative characters created for this narrative. Every technique, challenge, and detail depicted here reflects authentic historical practices that were essential to rural American life during this era. This video is created to honor and preserve the memory of the ingenuity, hard work, and resilience of American farmers and their families, and is not intended to represent any specific individuals or to offend anyone. The preservation methods shown here were real, widely practiced, and crucial to the survival of farming communities before widespread refrigeration became available.